Previously on the Trismegistus Academy. Alsaya Lamani is an attendee of the Ludum Academy for Fearsome Fighters, or the LAFF, and she regrets having come to the school. It's in an isolated dimension that the headmistress, Eloise Ludum, has control over, and when students are bad, they're tormented and sometimes even put in trials with little likelihood of survival, such as being sent out to face the beasts of the surrounding Little Lands. Well, Alsaya believes Eloise Ludum knows the secrets of who killed her older sister, Delilah, the once greatest hero of her home dimension. Alsaya is now largely convinced that she has to escape Eloise Ludum's academy, and the only way she can do that is to stay in Ludum's good books long enough until she can be brought to visit the Trismegistus Academy for heroic enlightenment. After Alsaya survived 5 treacherous hours in the Little Lands, Headmistress Ludum agrees to bring Alsaya as the school's main representative on a trip to the Trismegistus Academy. A series of competitions are set to be put on between the two schools, but that's not the main thing on Alsaya's mind at the moment. Now she's just determined to figure out how to use this trip to escape her captor and find a new lead in locating and getting revenge on her sister's killer. If you are enjoying this series, it would be super helpful for the series and channel's growth if you'd like, subscribe, and possibly share the series playlist, linked in the description, with a friend. Now enjoy the next chapter of the Trismegistus Academy from the point of view of one of its own students. When Jake Tagen first came to Tahe, he was convinced he didn't need to be there. He may have only been 14 years old, but he'd already spent over a year on a multiverse jumping superhero team. What did he need school for? Now that he'd been there for 3 months, he thought the Trismegistus Academy for Heroic Enlightenment was the greatest place in the multiverse. It even shifted his priorities and helped him establish a goal that he was running toward full tilt. "Alright Jake, you think you can handle 2 level 3s, bro?" Villainous asked, leaning up casually against a short marble pillar with a floating interface of hologram buttons above it. 2 level 3s? You remember I've literally fought dragons, demons, and supervillains before, right? Jake replied, standing eagerly in a grassy field on a beautiful sunny day with variously sized marble structures and pillars scattered around him. To Jake, they had once resembled ancient Greek and Egyptian ruins he'd seen in history books in his universe. But now, he just recognized them as the main aesthetic of the Trismegistus Academy. Villainous shook his head and the flames that perpetually spewed from his dark scalp waved in the air. "I can go up to 1 level 4 and 1 level 3, bro. But for someone who hasn't started the Resilience Combat Training class yet, I'm not supposed to give you tougher than that." Jake glanced back at his class, watching on the side. The entire Maverick class was present for this off-hours training session. Darwin, Anna, Niseko, Zenith, Amelia, and Kiko. Though Niseko wasn't paying attention, instead inspecting a large, vibrantly colored insect scuttling along the ground near her. Jake wanted everyone watching, but just decided he'd have to put on a good enough show that Niseko would have to start paying attention too. He used to be obsessed with trying to impress the girls in his class, but that wasn't his goal now. Well, not his main goal anyway. If he was going to create and run the multiverse's greatest superhero team someday, he figured the best place to start was to show his potential future teammates why he was the perfect choice for team leader. "Give me 2 level 5s, Villainous. I've faced way tougher than even that. Tell him, Anna." The blue scaly-skinned girl in the crowd, who'd known Jake the longest, perked up as he called to her.
"Oh, yeah, I know we shouldn't break the rules if you're not allowed to go that high, Villainous, but I'm pretty sure Jake can handle tougher than you think. We have fought some pretty scary stuff with the Sharp Gang."
Jake withheld, rolling his eyes at the name of the team they'd fought for. He loved the team, but never thought their goofy name reflected their ability level. Anna's defense of Jake's skills wasn't as rousing reassurance as he'd hoped for, but he still gave her a thankful smile, before turning back to the upperclassmen at the controls. The flame-spewing student casually crossed his arms. "Nobody doubts you got guts, kid, but I'm seriously not allowed to go that tough on you this early, without being in Resilience Combat." "Oh, come on, Villainous, we want to see what Jake can do," Zenith said from the sidelines. "Weren't the rules for this simulator made because most kids start here as babies and don't have any combat experience? Jake, Anna, Niseko, and I all do, so that rule shouldn't apply here. Besides, he's literally the class healer. If he gets hurt, he can just heal himself. Not that the Gleams can even seriously hurt us anyway, right?" Jake knew that Zenith was probably partially coming to bat for him so that he could take on some tougher Gleams himself, but it still felt good to have the class's eldest member backing him up. If anyone else was currently seen as the Maverick class leader, Jake knew it was probably Zenith. Jake liked Zenith and his entire class, but he was still determined to show off why he should be seen as the class's most heroically skilled member. Villainous started shaking his head again, but before he could speak, he noticed someone headed in their direction. He shrugged. "Well, I'll ask a prof, but if he says no, it's a no." Jake and the other students turned to see Professor Strone Goggins running across the field a short way from them. When he wasn't teaching a combat or self-discipline class, he was pretty much always running. Even if you wanted to talk to him during his so-called office hours, you pretty much always had to talk while running next to him. "Hey, Prof. Strone, one of the Mavericks wants to take 2 level 5s on the Gleam Combat Sim, but he hasn't started your class yet. Is that cool?" Hearing someone talk so casually to Professor Goggins made Jake anxious. Most teachers and faculty at the school were very kind, approachable, and warm. Strone was the one teacher that most students universally claimed to be afraid of upon starting his class. The Maverick class would be starting with him in 1 week, and Jake was a bit nervous, but also determined to get in there and quickly show off how good of a fighter he already was. Still running, Strone glanced over to Jake, who almost felt tempted to salute upon being looked at by the combat teacher, but just remained still and as straight-faced and determined as he could. Finally, Strone said, "Kid wants to fight above his weight level, I respect that. Go as high as he wants, and if you get in trouble, tell the other profs I gave the okay." He kept on running off into the distance without awaiting a reply. Once more, Villainous shook his head. "I really should have seen that coming. Alright, Jake. 2 level 5s it is." Jake almost asked him to crank it up more, but he'd never actually taken on a level 5 Gleam before. He figured 2 of them would let him put on enough of a show for his classmates. Jake bounced on his toes and clenched his fists. Bubbling green energy emerged around them, and he felt his body weight lessening. 2 glimmering golden beings appeared in the field before him. One was like a humanoid knight with a scorpion tail, and the other was a floating feminine figure with 3 orbs of light spinning around each hand. Villainous called out, "I gave you Gleam Pios and Gleam Floater. Good luck, kid." Jake didn't think he'd need the luck. His powers may have been more useful for healing than fighting, but he'd fought with them enough to know how to use them in combat. The scorpion-tailed Gleam Pios darted off to the side, running on all 4s and leaping between marble structures on the ground, while the Gleam Floater hovered up into the air and thrust a hand towards Jake. 3 of its orb lights soared towards him. Jake leapt off the ground and dodged the first 3 shots. They flew back towards the floater as she shot the 3 around her other hand at him next. He swooped to the left, but purposely let one get close enough to graze his arm. Or that was the intention. Instead, it smacked right into his shoulder and hit him like a brick, sending him spinning towards the ground. Luckily, he only spun until he managed to stick out a hand and steady himself smoothly against a tall pillar. He glanced back to the group. "Had to see how hard she could hit," he said, pretending he'd meant to be hit that hard. He pushed off the pillar as the floater was gathering all 6 of her orbs, rotating in front of her. As she did that, Jake's eye caught a figure leaping towards him from the side, just in time to swoop up out of the path of the Pios. He just barely evaded it when the 6 orbs of light all soared towards him at once. He tucked himself into a ball and they flew around him, but spun on his other side and came back in a tighter formation. He thrust his arm forward to help his body lunge back quicker midair and managed to evade the strike again. As he did, his eye fell on another unexpected figure walking up behind his friends. It was an elegant 7-foot-tall woman in flowing robes with a long bird-like beak in place of a mouth. Whether Headmistress Evangeline Trismegistus was there to stop him from fighting high-level gleams, or was just there to watch, Jake knew it was time to step up his game. He flew behind the orb, spiraling back towards the floater, now 30 feet above the field. The orbs stopped right in front of Jake and he nearly crashed into them, but he'd been ready for that and swooped around them, showing off how far he'd come with his once awkward flying abilities. He sped up and tackled right into the floater, knocking her out of the air towards the ground. She grabbed Jake by the waist and spun around. He tried as hard as he could to hold on, but even with his strength elevated beyond what you'd expect from someone his age and size, the floater was still able to tear him off her and hurl him toward the ground. Immediately after, she thrust her hands down and sent all 6 orbs firing towards him again, this time in a more chaotic pattern. He gritted his teeth, angry that he hadn't held on, but stayed focused. He slowed himself enough to not be hurt as his feet hit the ground. Then, ready to leap out of the way of the orbs, but just as he was about to jump, he saw the Gleam Pios leaping right into his path. He hesitated and was smacked by the first 2 orbs in the thigh and shoulder and rolled back across the ground. He leapt up quickly as the Gleam Pios' tail swung for his head. He overconfidently thrust both hands towards it to catch it, but it smacked right through his grip and hit him in the chest, sending him flying back, once again rolling across the ground he was becoming all too familiar with. In the distance, Jake saw Villainous reaching for the control panel. "Don't turn it off! I can do this, I swear!" He glanced back at his class and Evangeline towering over them. She gave a slight nod. He was good to keep going. He jumped off the ground again, just barely hovering as the Pios charged at him. Jake saw in the corner of his eye the Gleam floater swooping down with her arm cocked back and the orbs spinning around it. He needed a good move to regain his dignity. He flew right towards the coming Pios and saw in his peripheral that the floater was adjusting course to follow him. The Pios got close and leapt acrobatically into the air, spinning around and swinging its tail towards him to knock him into the ground. He managed to catch the tail and be swung around with it until he let go and was launched faster than he'd ever flown right at the floater. He hurled some of the green energy off his hand into her face to distract her, then tackled his shoulder into her stomach. They both fell towards the ground again, but this time, Jake scrambled around her body, wrapped an arm around her neck, then angled her towards the ground. She struck dirt face first, and Jake flipped off her, rolling to a semi-graceful stop. He looked over to the control panel and could see that her health had dropped by about a quarter. It wasn't much, but at least he'd gotten a solid hit in. Unfortunately, the Pios was already mid-swing of its tail before Jake noticed it had gotten close to him again. He was struck in the back of the head so hard that he got dizzy and was flung right into one of the marble pillars. He pushed back off it, stumbling and raising his arms in front of his head as he looked around for the next hit coming. The Gleam Pios was clambering up a pillar towards higher ground as a light orb whizzed right past Jake's face. He leapt forward in case more were coming, and was hit once again, this time in the leg, spinning his body around and slamming his head into the ground. He was hurting more than he even realized he could be hurt from fighting the simulations, but he got back up again and flew straight up into the air. The Gleam Pios leapt at him and he dodged around it, then snatched its tail, hoping he was strong enough to hurl it at the Gleam floater. He wasn't. Jake was yanked from the sky by his own grip on the tail. He let go and tried to stabilize himself, but was struck again by 4 of the light orbs and crashed into the ground once more. Jake slammed his fist into the dirt and started picking himself up again. "I've got this! I've got this!" The fight went on for another 5 minutes, and while Jake did get a few solid hits in, he was hit himself far more times, and his supersuit was covered in dirt from how many reunions he had with the ground. Eventually, instructed by Evangeline, Villainous did shut off the simulation. Jake was lying on his back, but upon seeing his foes flicker away, he rolled onto his knees and started standing again. "No, come on, I've got to do this, I know I can win!" A gentle hand fell on his shoulder. Without even looking, he knew it was the headmistress. Panting, Jake said, I'm sorry, I can do better, I swear." She knelt to meet the exhausted student's eyeline. "Jake, do you know what is more impressive than a hero who wins every fight they are faced with? One with the resilience to keep getting back up, no matter how many times they are knocked down. The level of resilience you've shown here today is heartwarming reassurance to me that creating the Maverick class was a worthwhile step for this school. Well done, Jake. I am proud of you, and you should be proud of yourself." The rest of the class clapped for him. Jake was still frustrated that he hadn't been able to beat the level 5s, but having the headmistress praise him like that did feel pretty fantastic. Evangeline said the training session could continue, but asked Villainous to keep the Gleams at level 4 or less. Zenith wanted to go next, but the headmistress asked him, Jake, and Anna to step aside from the group for a moment. Darwin took the opportunity to go up next, as Jake stepped aside for the private chat. The headmistress began, "At tomorrow's school-wide assembly, an announcement is going to be made, and a guest will appear on stage with me who is likely to rightfully cause a concerned reaction from the 3 of you. A very troubling figure of the multiverse has created an academy that is akin to a dark reflection of our own academy." Jake had been about to use the energy that emanated from his hands to start healing his injuries, but was too intrigued by what the headmistress was saying. What kind of guest would be concerning to him, Anna, and Zenith specifically? "Encouraged by Professor Goggins, I have made an agreement with the headmistress of this rival school, both to give our students a chance to compete with children of similar physical education, but also so that we can keep a closer eye on this school. I do not revel in using Tagen and its students as a lure to keep this foe close. but I am hoping, in doing so, we will discover a way to shut down this school and apprehend its headmistress. She does not have the best interest of her students at heart, and many children have already lost their lives simply by attending and not living up to their faculty's expectations." Jake was getting more excited the more Evangeline spoke. Another super school full of students to compete with, headed by a villain that needed to be taken down? This all felt like good news to him. Zenith's own expression was more curious than excited. "Why are us three the ones you're worried about? Why not the rest of the Maverick class, or the other kids here?" "Before I answer that, I must unfortunately ask that you all act tomorrow as though you have not been warned in advance of our guest's arrival. She demanded that her presence be a surprise, likely thinking particularly of you three, but I deemed that unfair to allow her arrival to alarm you in this way. This headmistress is quite theatrical, and is always looking to make as big of an impact as possible with her presence." That little clue helped it click in for Jake. His eyes widened. "Is it Eloise Ludum?" Anna and Zenith both looked at him confused, but with a brief second to process, they both realized in horror he was likely right. The headmistress nodded. "Yes, Eloise Ludum has started her own academy where she is teaching her students to be ruthless fighters at any cost." "And you invited her here?" Zenith yelled. It made Jake jump. He'd never heard Zenith snap like that before. He'd also never heard anyone snap at Headmistress Trismegistus. "How many people has she murdered in her fighting pits? What's wrong with you?" As always, the headmistress stayed perfectly calm and collected, looking more sympathetic than bothered by the outburst. "I understand your frustration and concern. You, more so than anyone, know the pain she has caused tens of thousands of people from across the multiverse. But that is why I hope you can understand that I have only made this decision because I believe it may be our best lead towards stopping Eloise Ludum's violent antics forever." Zenith still looked furious. Anna looked concerned. But Jake was barely holding back a smile. Eloise Ludum had gone quiet for a while, but she had once been a notorious villain of the Sharp Gangs. They'd tried taking her down multiple times, but never done so successfully. Bigger problems had arisen in the multiverse, so it had been some time since they'd gone after her, but Jake thought this made a perfect opportunity for him to show off what kind of hero he was. If he could take down a villain even the Sharp Gang had failed to defeat, there'd be no denying he was worthy of leading a valiant team of heroes after graduating. Maybe even sooner. Proudly, Jake proclaimed, "Whatever you want us to do to help take down Ludum, we'll do it. Whatever she's up to with this school, she's not gonna get away with it." Anna and Zenith both looked at Jake, baffled by his lack of hesitancy about the situation. Evangeline gave a slight smile. "I appreciate your courage, Jake, but all I need from you and your class is to do the best you can with your education. You will be permitted to try out for competitions with this school if you meet Professor Goggins' physical skill requirements, but outside of that, you must leave Ludum to myself and the faculty. We have even discussed this with the leaders of the Sharp Gang. While they currently have their hands full with the Archon demons, they have agreed to help face Ludum when the time comes." Jake didn't argue, but there was no way he'd just sit on the sidelines. He was going to do all he could to make sure he got to take down Eloise Ludum himself. Zenith remained in a sour mood through the rest of the chat, but soon the three of them were permitted to get back to the training simulator with the rest of their class. Jake did his best to focus and cheer on his classmates, but he was too distracted and scheming. He didn't have enough information to make a real plan, but he came up with hundreds of possible scenarios in his head where he got to take down Ludum and be praised by the Sharp Gang and everyone at Tagen. That night, as they often did, the class gathered at a campfire to tell stories. An upper year named Parvel Markopoulos was telling the 4th chapter of a story of gods and monsters from his own world. As fascinating as the story was, Jake just wanted to get to bed to get to the assembly the next day. When the tale was wrapped up, Jake headed right back to his housing. Each member of the Maverick class had their own mini home surrounding the fire pit. They were all marble and glass from the outside, looking a bit of a blend of modern and rustic, but on the inside they had plenty of modern amenities that Jake was used to from his own world, such as a small kitchen, a bathroom, and electric lights. He was about to shut everything down, but before he did, he reached into a single drawer beside his bed. He pulled out a wristwatch called a Mujwawood. It was another silly name in regards to the Sharp Gang, a multiverse jumping wristwatch thingy. The whole team used them to teleport to different dimensions and to communicate with one another. He strapped it on and considered calling Sterling, the co-leader of the Sharp Gang who had helped get him into Tahe in the first place. Usually the school only took students aged 7 or younger. 0 to 7 is the period of time when kids' brains are most malleable and are essentially subconsciously wired by their surroundings, which determines how they will perceive their world and what is possible for them during the rest of their lives. Evangeline hadn't wanted students to start older than that, because the faculty would then have to put too much time into helping the new students unlearn the limiting beliefs that they may have been wired with in their early years. Sterling and the Sharp Gang's other leader, Alexis Jones, had convinced Evangeline to try making a new class of students, coming to the school later in their childhoods to see how they'd compare to the long-term students. Jake knew their class was already exceeding expectations, but if he started just outright breaking rules to try and take down Ludum, that could put his whole class in jeopardy. If he really was going to do some secret work to try and take out Ludum himself, he'd have to be sneaky about it. That was why he reconsidered calling Sterling. He was going to ask for advice, but he knew there was a good chance Sterling would just tell him to do as he was told and let the faculty handle Ludum. And Gilles had been somewhere between an older brother and a dad to Jake since he joined the Sharp Gang, but Jake also knew Sterling was really into the idea of working at Tahe someday. He wasn't going to encourage Jake to go against Evangeline's wishes. Jake ended up passing out with the bracelet still on his wrist. He kept it on through the next morning. He woke up and went to the usual morning meditation circle, but had a hard time keeping his mind from spiraling on thoughts of the assembly. Jake was grateful it wasn't an end-of-day thing, or he'd have just been thinking about it all day. Before any of their other classes that morning, a crowd of 1,241 students gathered at a half coliseum that looked down onto a stone slab stage, where the headmistress was standing and greeting students and faculty as they came in. The Maverick class of only 7 students sat near the front row of the Coliseum, with their upper-class mentors behind them. Jake sat with Darwin on one side of him and Anna on the other. Zenith dropped down on Anna's other side, and as soon as he did, from behind, Parvel put a hand on Zenith's shoulder and quickly said something about being ready for this. Jake guessed that some of the upper years may have been informed on the situation as well. Zenith still looked frustrated, and wasn't doing much to hide it. Evangeline eventually quieted down the crowd and started the assembly. She spoke about competing with another school and how they wanted students at Tahe to feel safe but also face challenges to strengthen themselves, and blah blah blah. Jake did his best not to look around for Ludum, but he knew she had to be there somewhere. There was a small pillared building just behind the stage. He assumed she must be in there waiting. Every word Evangeline said just stretched on, building Jake's anticipation. He knew he couldn't just leap up on stage and attack Ludum when she appeared, but he really wanted to. Finally, Evangeline said, "While we will not be forcing anyone to participate in the coming events, a set of games and competitions are being planned by our staff in collaboration with the Ludum Academy for Fearsome Fighters in Dimension Z009. Jake and Anna did their best to look shocked, and Zenith somewhat followed suit. A cloud of pink and green smoke burst on the stage, and as it cleared, Eloise Ludum was revealed behind it. Her arms were spread wide, and she had a horrible grin as she walked up to the front of the stage. There was some clapping and some muttering in confusion. Jake imagined there were more people in the crowd who had at least some knowledge of Eloise Ludum. He hoped that plenty of them did, so that when he took her down, there would be more people who realized what a big deal it was. Ludum spoke as if she'd gotten thunderous applause. "Ah, thank you all. It is a pleasure to be here, and might I say, with the caliber of students I've found from my academy versus the cute little lot of you I see here today. Well," she looked down towards Jake, Anna, and Zenith. "I do believe this is going to be quite some fun." Jake let his look of surprise slip to one of determination, thinking to himself, "Oh, it's gonna be fun all right, but not for you, Ludum." "But you don't have to take my word for the quality of the fighters to be found at the LAFF. Please give a warm welcome to the Ludum Academy's finest." Out from the building behind marched 7 students, led by a girl with a similar color scheme to Jake's own costume, but darker and punkier. His first thought was that she was incredibly attractive, but he tried to remind himself that she was the enemy. Somehow that didn't make him less attracted to her. The 7 students lined up across the stage, striking very confident poses. Some of the students looked like normal kids, albeit in edgy attire, but one of the girls had flaky skin and a tail like that of the demons Jake had faced with the Sharp Gang in Dimension D667. Another boy's body was half converted into purple slime and dripped onto the stage next to him. The way Jake looked at these kids, it was like they were all the mini-bosses he'd have to face before taking out Ludum. Little did he know not all of them were as loyal to her as he thought. Alsaya Lamani is our current star pupil. Alsaya, if you please, show these adorable children what a true fearsome fighter can do. The girl nodded and tapped each foot on the ground twice. Her body looked like it was subtly vibrating after that, and she sprinted off one side of the stage in a blur. She skidded to a stop a fair ways in the distance, turned back, and ran for the stage twice as fast as before. Ludum pulled a fist-sized rock out of her mound of hair and gingerly tossed it straight up above her head. Alsaya sprang off the ground just before reaching the stage, soared over her fellow students, spun in midair, and bicycle-kicked the stone straight up into the sky. She landed on the other side of the stage and kept running before turning back again. Jake completely lost track of where the rock went, but Alsaya sprinted back at the stage once more, leapt onto it, and skidded to a stop, then held up a finger as if telling everyone to wait. There was a moment of pause. Then she slowly opened her palm, and out of nowhere the rock landed right back down, directly into her open hand. That was some insane speed and precision. He wanted to think he could still take her in a fight, but he thought back to the prior day's Gleam battle and how he'd been sure he could defeat them as well. He'd have to work extra hard in Strone Goggins' class if he was going to be certain he could take Ludum's students. The other Ludum Academy fighters went on to show off what they could do, and Jake just tried to ignore his concerns and process all of their abilities, so he could talk to his class and figure out what weaknesses they might have later. Eventually, all the LAFF students got their moment to show off, and then Evangeline went on to announce that the first competition against Ludum's Academy would be a combat tournament in 3 months. There would be tryouts within the school to determine what 7 students from each academy would participate. Jake wondered if there was any chance the entire Maverick class would make it in. It wasn't likely with how many impressive upper year students there were at Tagen, but at least they'd have a few months of Strone's Resilience combat training under their belts by the time the tryouts came around. With all the announcements made, there was a round of slightly more enthusiastic applause, and the assembly started to disperse. Jake wanted to get down to training immediately, but he also knew that as flashy and flowery as Ludum looked, she was also a fierce fighter herself. He wondered if there was any chance he'd be strong enough to take his shot at her in 3 months, when the schools reconvened for the tournament. As Tahe students were rising from their seats and muttering, the crowd was getting chaotic. But through it, Jake noticed something odd. A green blur darted out of the crowd and sprinted across Tahe's grounds. It had to be the first girl to show off her powers, but where was she going? Ludum was still on stage with the rest of her students, and at least acted like she hadn't noticed her star pupil run off, as she said some kind of sarcastic goodbye to Evangeline and the other faculty. Jake slipped away from his class and ran in the direction she'd gone. When he was far enough from the assembly, he flew up just off the ground to pick up speed. He got near the outskirts of the school grounds, which just led out into forests, mountains, and farmlands where the school's food was grown. Was she going to sabotage their food supply? Had she turned and gone somewhere else to steal something from Evangeline? He floated up a bit higher, still looking around, until a voice quietly called from the ground behind him. "Hey, you're a student here, right?" Standing behind him with a trail of dirt falling from where she'd just run was Alsaya. Jake lit up his hands in green energy. His projectiles weren't particularly harmful, but she didn't know that. Jake tried to sound tough as he said, "What are you doing here? If Ludum sent you to mess with us, you're not going to get away with it, not with me around." But as Jake spoke, he noticed that she was looking back towards the Coliseum anxiously. "Would you chill and don't attract attention? I need your help." Jake cautiously lowered back to the ground, but didn't get closer. He wasn't sensing any hostility, but she could have just been a good actor. "Look, you go to this school, right? Is it, safe here? Are you really allowed to leave? Do the teachers torture you or anything?" What? No, of course not. They're not monsters here like Ludum. This place is awesome and not run by a freaky psychopath. Her fearful expression shifted into one of relief. Oh, Alhamdulillah, it was all true. You have to help me. Headmistress Ludum is nuts. I've got to get away from her. I've been pretending to like her so I could get here, but she nearly got me killed yesterday, and that wasn't the first time. You hate Ludum too? Why are you at her school? Alcaya growled. Of course I hate her. I'd have killed her myself by now if she wasn't basically a god in her school's dimension. She made the academy sound great when her scout first found me, but once you're there, she doesn't let you leave unless you graduate or die trying. That's why I want to go here. This place sounds like it has the few good things about her academy, but you're not risking the headmistress killing you for just messing up. Jake completely softened. His mindset shifted from facing a rival to facing someone in need. Though soon it did shift again. Wow, that's horrible. I can take you to Headmistress Trismegistus. She's awesome and she'll know what... But then Jake had a thought. He glanced down at the mujwa wood on his wrist, then back at Alcaya. Wait. We could get you away from her right now if that's what you really want. But what if you could help me take her and her whole school down instead? The first episodes of this series have taken way more rewriting than any other series I've done this year, but I think now that I've got the first few episodes locked down and the premise locked down, we're headed in a really cool direction with this series. If you're enjoying this and you haven't watched Mythal Lethal or Starseed Psyche or The Summoner's Beasts or any of the other long-running series that I've been doing this year, you might want to go check those out. They're all up on the PopCross homepage now. If you want the high-resolution art and inks, those go up on the Patreon for free a day after a video's released or sometime in the near future after a video releases. And besides that, that's all for today, except of course for ending this video on some kind of positive or inspiring note. And the thought I want to leave people with today is really a message that was built into part of this episode, which is the importance of resilience when you're trying to accomplish something. On the road to any big success that you're going after, there are going to be tons and tons of failures. But the only way you guarantee that you don't succeed in the end is by giving up when you hit one of those failures. I remember in the first year building PopCross Studios, there were tons of things that almost broke me and made me want to give up. But I didn't, and now looking back, I'm incredibly glad that I didn't. So I hope that's inspiring to someone out there. I love you all, and I'll see you all in the next episode on Monday, which is actually going to be a writing advice video on how to write great villains. I'll see you there. Goodbye.